Okay, to finish up on the Shays Rebellion, the lessons of Shays Rebellion, we want to talk about the ending of the Shays Rebellion and think about those things, and then talk about the lessons that were learned. So was going forward in the winter of 1786 to 1787, and Daniel Shays was fairly successful in getting the his followers to stop the judges from hearing their cases. And so there was concern about the violence towards judges, the way in which they're being held hostage, or there was also burning down of courthouses as a way to burn up the paperwork that's necessary to foreclose on the farms. And so the people of the government and the Massachusetts legislature said, well, this seems to be a problem that the national government could solve. This is a rebellion. This job that any government needs to do is to provide security, and there is clearly not security. And furthermore, there is a challenge to the idea of the rule of law. This is not how a representative government is supposed to work. You're supposed to follow the laws. And so the state legislature, the representative of Massachusetts, took this issue to the National Congress under the Articles of Confederation and said, we've got to do something about that. Send an army to put down this rebellion. And if not, other states are going to follow the same thing. Even though we're being affected by this first, this is going to hurt all other states. That was presented to the National Congress, and most of the states just turned around and said, tell us again where this is going on. Oh, it's in Western Massachusetts. Yeah, we're in North Carolina. We're in Georgia. We are not going to spend any of our money or send any money to the national government to pay for an army to put down something that is a Massachusetts problem. There is no person from Maryland, there's no person from North Carolina, from Georgia, from South Carolina who is being affected by this. And so the national government was unable to provide the support that Massachusetts was looking for. So Massachusetts had to do it on their own. They used their own state militia. It cost $500,000 to pay for this for other private armies to be able to put down Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion was not one that led to a large loss of life. Shays Rebellion was one that provided important lessons about the situation that was going on, the problems of the Articles of Confederation. And so important lessons from Shays Rebellion. And it's one that the framers of the U.S. Constitution took with them as they went into the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So remember, 1786 to 1787 is when Shays Rebellion was going on. And the Constitutional Convention where the Constitution was eventually written, was done in the summer of 1787. So this event was at the top of the framers' minds in thinking about whatever system of government we're going to needs to deal with something like this. And the first thing is that there was a recognition that the Articles of Confederation were fundamentally flawed. The national government under the Articles of Confederation was too weak to put down this threat to basic security and the rule of law. And so some had this lesson that said what we need to do is to be able to increase the power of the national government. We need to be able to do that. We need to give the national government at least the authority to put down a rebellion where judges are being held hostage, that courthouses are being burnt down. We need to do that. At the same time, another important lesson was learned, that the framers saw this idea of we the people, the regular people, as unwashed farmers with pitchforks who did not respect the rule of law. And so if you come up with a system of government where you wanted to maintain some influence, some input by we the people, and I use the phrase we the U.S. Constitution and the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution starts with the words we the people. And so that's the phrase that we use as a placeholder for us to think about the role that the people play in this institution. And the framers saw we the people as the people who were swayed by, they believed that Daniel Shays was a dangerous populist who was be able to rouse people's anger and get them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do because he was so persuasive in his arguments. And they were worried that that would happen a lot. And so if you had a system of government where people had a lot of influence, they worried that there would be a rise of populists like that, people who would say things that sound really attractive, that people will follow because it sounds good, but it isn't necessarily what is good for the country or even necessarily in their long-term interests. Because if you remember, many of the economic and political elite believed that paying off the debt to France and Spain that accumulated during the Revolutionary War was a critically important step. We couldn't trade anymore with Britain because we had just fought a Revolutionary War with them, and they weren't really interested in trading with us. And so we needed to find a way to be able to trade with France and Spain, but France and Spain said, we're not going to trade with you unless you pay off some of the debts you already have. Because in order to do trade back then, you would be relying on credit because ships could crash on their way from France or Spain to or vice versa. And so it was relying on this idea of credit. And they said, we're not going to do that unless you can pay off this debt that had already been accumulated. And the national government under the Irish Confederation couldn't do that. It couldn't, because it would turn around and say, well, we need to pay off this Revolutionary War debt that was like $42 million worth of debt. Spain said, well, look, we're good. You're good for it. You don't have to do fully 42 million. We know that. But if you could do, I don't know, say 12 million as a down payment, then we can start having trade and everything will be good. And when this idea was brought to the national government under the Irish Confederation, many of the states, like North Carolina, like Georgia, turned around and said, we're not going to pay anything. We're not going to do it. We have other things. We don't have the resources and we don't have the interest in doing it. And so we could only raise about $3 million of the $12 million that they had asked us to at least pay for. And so there were views on both sides. What's interesting is both sides, both Shays Rebellion and the government and the economic elites, believed that their position was right. And going into the Constitutional Convention, there was a concern that the Irish Confederation failed in its fundamental job of actually doing, passing legislation and taking action to provide security. But at the same time, they also brought with them a really important lesson that said, that we are talking about are individuals who are easily persuaded by charismatic leaders, and they themselves are drunk, unwashed farmers who are just lazy and don't want to pay their taxes. And so if you're going to have a system of government, the authority of which comes from we the people, when you don't trust people, that's a complicated system. And that's what we're going to be looking at when we talk about the U.S. Constitution, when we see the foundations of the U.S. Constitution, the sort of provisions that were put into place. It was those 18th century concerns that the framers were trying to solve and trying to think about. And so now we're going to move on and talk about the Constitutional Convention and some of the key compromises that were made during the negotiations and how that influenced the structure of the document that we have in the system.